Andrew Jackson, murderer, tyrant, defacer of the Jeffersonian legacy, Native American abuser, destroyer of the American economy, and one of the most revered presidents of the United States.
When Jackson became president in 1828, he brought new political, social, and economic ideas to the White House that would perpetuate the policies of the Jeffersonian democracy. Jefferson's fundamental policy was to increase the rights of the common man. Since Jackson considered himself to be the leader of the common man, this was one policy of the Jeffersonian government which he agreed with. In addition, Jackson and Jefferson shared the same belief in regards to the national bank, both believing that it was unconstitutional. Another policy that Jackson followed, which was part of the Jeffersonian government, was the removal of the Native Americans in the South. However, Jackson used violence to resettle them in a manner opposite than Jefferson's peaceful removal. As president, Jackson attempted to perpetuate the Jeffersonian democracy. However, he actually dilapidated the Republican policies set forth by Jefferson.
Jackson was born on a small farm between North and South Carolina. Naturally, this inclined him to believe that plain people should be in charge of the government. This led to his abolition of property in office, instead rotating office holders in a method that became known as the spoils system. In Carolina, he was raised on Jeffersonian ideals, leading him to try and follow in Jefferson's footsteps. He shared Jefferson's strict interpretation of the Constitution when he supported the national government's right to impose tariffs, in his efforts to destroy the American system, and in vetoing the national bank. Then Jackson became a lawyer, making friends with the rich and acquiring land and slaves of his own. When he became president, his past made him appealing to all classes of society. Having been a landowner, he knew how to gain their votes. Being a self-made man, he wanted to back entrepreneurs and other self-made men. He tried to help these kinds of people through many of his policies, like supporting the Tariff of 1828 and in the court case Charles River Bridge Company versus Warren Bridge Company in 1837. Finally, his history as a military general on the War of 1812 made him a hero, but it also made him violent and led him to believe that military force could solve problems. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the Military Force Bill of 1833 both violently forced compliance.
Andrew Jackson's policies and achievements prove him not to be a champion of the average man, but rather a tyrant who expanded the power of the presidency at the expense of minority groups. From the first moment Jackson came into office, his tyrannical nature was apparent. With the spoils system, Jackson removed many high-ranking political officials only to replace them with his allies. Though he claimed to be purging the government of corruption, he was doing the opposite. One of his old army comrades absconded with more than $1 million, proving that Jackson's appointees were far from trustworthy. Though the spoils system was supposed to be a way to create openness between the working classes and the non-producing classes of society, many of the men appointed came from wealth and social eminence, doing nothing to support Jackson's so-called openness. Jackson's betrayal of the minority groups persisted throughout his presidency. The first example of this is during South Carolina's nullification crisis, when Jackson strengthened the federal government by stating that it has the power to establish tariffs. He went against the states' rights interpretation of the Constitution in favor of one that benefited the national government, and went as far as implementing a bill threatening military force. Andrew Jackson also enforced his own power through his bank policy. He justified an illegal transfer of federal government silver and gold to his own pet banks by claiming that his victory at the polls gave him the power to act independently of Congress. Jackson used his policy of representing the common man as a way of building up the executive branch. Jackson's Native American policy also showcased his expansion of the presidency. He went against the Supreme Court's ruling and implemented a removal policy, displacing over 90,000 people. This removal policy is one of the most obvious showcases of how Jackson expanded the presidency by going against the Supreme Court at the expense of a minority group, the natives. Though the majority of Jackson's policies strengthened his depiction as a tyrant, some of his policies did help to break down parts of the strong federal government. Jackson rejected national subsidies for transportation projects, stating that they infringe on the reserved power of the states. He destroyed Henry Clay's American system, which had increased the burden of taxation. Nevertheless, in order to bring about these changes, Jackson vetoed more bills than any of the previous presidents, which could be seen as yet another way he increased presidential power.
Of Jeffersonian democracy, Andrew Jackson ultimately undermined them with his tumultuous presidency. First and foremost, Jackson completely contradicted Jefferson's ideal of limiting the government when he instead enhanced the authority of the president. This complete disregard for a major Jeffersonian ideal is portrayed most clearly during the South Carolina nullification crisis. When the state argued for its right to nullify or void the Tariff Act of 1828, Jackson's constitutional rebuttal contradicted Jefferson's previous argument in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798. Jefferson and Madison put forth the idea that sovereignty lay in the states, not the people. Jackson argued the opposite. He even passed the Force Bill to coerce South Carolina into complying with his policies by military force. Jefferson would have been astounded and terrified by this distinct expansion of the president's power. Another example of Jackson's utter disregard and misunderstanding of Jeffersonian principles is when he destroyed the Second National Bank. Yes, Thomas Jefferson initially opposed the national banking system as well, but the important thing to note here is that Jefferson did not completely diminish all of the established Hamiltonian policies, because he knew that actions that drastic would throw the country into both economic and political crisis. Thus, Jackson sullied Jefferson's ideals by expunging the bank from the American economy, copying Jefferson's argument. With all the acts and vetoes that Jackson enforced to benefit his views and his views only put a damper on Jeffersonian values. It was completely his actions, not Jefferson's, that led to many developing issues in the country during the age of Jackson. The economic depression of 1837 to 1843 being one example, the increased power of the president a second, and the inhumane removal of Native Americans a third.
Andrew Jackson was a patriot and a traitor. He was one of the greatest of generals and wholly ignorant of the art of war. A writer brilliant, elegant, eloquent, and without being able to compose a correct sentence or spell words of 4 syllables. The first of statesmen, he never devised, he never framed a measure. He was the most candid of men and was capable of the profoundest dissimulation. A most law-defying, law-obeying citizen, a stickler for discipline, he never hesitated to disobey his superior. A democratic aristocrat, an urbane savage, an atrocious saint.